Alexander.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thanks, President. I ask unanimous consent President, I ask unanimous consent to officiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yesterday at the State of the Union address by the President, I asked to join me. Each member of the Senate gets a pass, a gallery pass for a spouse or a constituent or someone. I asked Elizabeth Dandridge, a Head Start teacher from Cincinnati, to join me, and she sat in the gallery. First time she had actually been in the Capitol. She's taught at Head Start for 10 years. Mrs. Dandridge isn't paid a lot of money. We unfortunately pay Head Start teachers and Head Start teaching assistants not a whole lot more than minimum wage. And it's important that people understand that, the number of low-wage workers in this country. But one thing I want to say, then I'll certainly yield to Senator Sessions, is that 100 years ago, one of the reasons to increase the minimum wage is because it matters so much to those families who work so hard and get so little for it. President Obama said no one in this country that works full-time should live in poverty. He's exactly right. But the lesson of history is this. 100 years ago, this month, Henry Ford made an announcement that he would pay every one of his workers, the sweeper at the factory floor and the worker in the assembling the autos, $5 a day. Lots of his business friends were outraged. They couldn't believe he was doing this. He understood it wasn't necessarily out of the goodness of his heart. I don't know his heart, certainly. But what it was a good business decision, because he knew if he put $5 a day into his workers' pockets, they'd begin to spend that money. He would create more prosperity for the community. A number of those workers might be able to buy cars that Ford assembled, and we'd all be better off. That's really also what the minimum wage debate is about. It's not just increasing the minimum wage for those hundreds of thousands of families in my state that work at such low income levels. It's also going to help the economy in the state of Delaware, state of Alabama, and the state of Ohio. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Well, the flood insurance program is important for America, and it's important to a lot of my constituents in Alabama, and they are concerned about it. The reform that has been passed into law is fundamentally the right approach to fixing the difficulties that we have, in my opinion. It moves this program from a big subsidy to a program that's actuarially sound, self-sustaining. I think that's the appropriate goal. I think at some point that a person living in the interior of the United States should not be required to have money extracted from him or her or their family to pay for somebody who built their house on shifting sands on a beach somewhere. That's just my view of it. And I think but people find themselves unexpectedly maybe and otherwise in dangerous circumstances where floods may occur rapidly or may not occur for decades. In my hometown of Mobile, a number of years ago, they had a big flood problem. A lot of homes were damaged. It was a 100-year flood, they said, and it was a much concern for everybody. I think a lot of people didn't have flood insurance. Well, the next year, it flooded again. So they had 2 100-year floods in 2 consecutive years. I just say that to say it's very difficult to manage a program like this in a sound way and to fully anticipate all the dangers. What I'm hearing from my constituents is that premiums are going up incredibly rapidly, very high for some people, multiple times what their present premiums are. There's little time to protest or get a clear review of it, and they think this ought to be more thoughtfully done and phased in a more effective way. I tend to believe that. But I do not intend to support legislation that would fundamentally undo, reverse, or retreat from the principle that was established when we passed this legislation previously that would say this program, the flood insurance program, should be self-sustaining. I think that's the right principle. It doesn't have to be done overnight. It needs to be done carefully. It doesn't need to be done in a way that people struggling to get by, hardworking Americans find their flood insurance premiums, which they must have before they can get a loan to buy a house in a flood-prone area. It doubles, triples, or quadruples, and it can make them as much virtually as their house payment. So this is the problem we're facing. Now, my colleague, Senator Coburn, has made a budget point of order against the legislation. And I think the budget point of order is well taken. The chairman of the Budget Committee, Senator Patty Murray, and her staff has agreed that the legislation violates the budget. And I, as ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, certainly agree with that. There are 2 aspects of it, of the budget point of order. Maybe I can summarize it this way. There's probably more to it than this, but in essence, we can say 2 things about it. One, the bill spends more than the Banking Committee was authorized to spend. That creates a violation of the budget in itself. The other violation is it adds to the debt. It spends more money than we have, and the result would be to add to the debt of the United States. Now, what the bill supporters have done is come before the presiding officer and move to waive all violations. They say this legislation is so important that we should just waive the violations and not worry about it. Well, I believe we need to worry about the budget. We need to think about it. There may be occasions when the budget point of order should be waived and we go forward, and there are points in time when it should not be waived. My view is, colleagues, we should not waive all budget points of order. I do not believe that that's the appropriate vote at this time. We imposed a budget. We promised to limit spending to certain amounts, and we should stay within that and not add to the debt. So I feel strongly that we ought to adhere to the budget, not go around waiving it any time somebody wants to spend more money, and thereby weaken the commitment we made to the American people when we established certain limits on spending. So we've adopted it. We passed it by law both houses of Congress, the President has signed the legislation that sets spending limits. So this bill violates those limits. Now there are two aspects of it. I've given thought to this. Maybe good people can disagree. This is my view of it. We should not spend more on the flood insurance program than was projected and agreed to and add to the debt of the United States of America. We absolutely should not do that. We shouldn't reduce the constraints we placed on the Fed program, the flood program, so we can spend more money and then borrow the money to pay for that extra cost. That is not what we should do. This budget point of order would allow that to happen. The motion to waive the budget objection raised by Senator Coburn, waiving that, and all objections to the bill would waive that. Now there's a second violation, it appears, and that one is it spends more than the Banking Committee was authorized to spend. I think that's a somewhat different issue. Some might disagree. Under these circumstances, I think that aspect of a budget point of order could be waived. And this is why. The flood insurance program under the law that is today is to be moved to a fully self-sustaining, actuarially sound program, where all the premiums come in are sufficient to pay all the claims that go out, like any other insurance company in America tries to operate. That's the principle that Congress, both houses, established when they passed the reform recently. So, I don't think it's necessarily to be considered a tax increase or a violation of the budget if this insurance program, which is part of the Banking Committee's jurisdiction, creates higher premiums, about $40 for most people and $80 for upper-income people, higher premiums to ensure that the program, while it's transitioning, remains sound and is ultimately paid for. I think that's the kind of waiver that may be justified. And I'm really impressed with Senator Toomey, how hard he's worked on his legislation to create an alternative to the base legislation that's before us today that I don't think can be justified, because it adds to the debt of the United States. And we don't need to be adding to the debt. Every time somebody has a problem, colleagues, and they propose a solution, the tendency is not to find reductions in spending somewhere to fix this problem that they have. They look around and see if they can just borrow the money and not pay for the extension. So under this proposal by Senator Toomey, it appears it would violate the budget point of order that says we would raise the debt ceiling. It would spend more, but it would not add to the deficit, because the additional spending is paid for by premiums paid for by the flood insurance beneficiaries. It's not taxing the American citizens to subsidize a group of people who have flood insurance when the general citizenry does not have flood insurance. It's an increased fee on the people who benefit from flood insurance in the short term to transition this flood insurance program from the more rigorous self-sustaining to the more rigorous self-sustaining program. From one that's not self-sustaining or is altered or rather draconian in the way it's being implemented. So I think Senator Toomey's legislation May not be perfect, but I believe his legislation is actuarially sound. It raises sufficient revenue from the people who benefit from the flood insurance program to transition in a more gentle and logical and reasonable way to the new program. So it would transition in an effective way, and it does not, according to the people who really understand this, it does not threaten the integrity of the reforms that have been voted into law. I think a good case can be made that the base legislation before us today that violates several budget points of order not only violates budget points of order, but it is drafted in a way that threatens the very integrity of the underlying legislation. We should not do that. We should not weaken the commitment we made as a Congress in any way that would lead us in a situation in which we don't follow through on the commitment we had to make sure that flood insurance becomes actuarially sound and is self-sufficient. So, Mr. President, I would just, for what it's worth, share with my colleagues my belief that we should not waive all budget points of order, although there may be a possibility that we can waive the point of order with regard to the spending limit, because the increased spending would be paid for by increased premiums on the insurance policies which benefit the very people who would pay the increased premiums, which is under the Toomey proposal. So I appreciate my colleagues, Senator Menendez and others, who are striving to alleviate some of the harsh results of the transition of the current law, but I think their proposal runs a risk of abandoning the commitments that we've made, and I believe their plan is not, their plan would add to the debt, and I think the Toomey substitute would be the preferable way for us to meet the problems of this very rough transition period we're in without adding to the debt and without threatening to abandon the good goal of an actuarially sound flood insurance program. Mr. President, I appreciate the chair and would yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the question occurs in the motion to waive the PAYGO point of order raised by the senator from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates,
Ask Senator Menendez to come up here for a moment, please.
Mr. Coburn. Yeah. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Joe Hands, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Brown, Isaacson, Landrieu, Menendez, and Sanders. Senators voting in the negative: Joe Hands, McCain, and Sessions. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Beckidge, aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Markey.
I don't know. You are correct.
Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Corker, No. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye.
So, what else is going on?
Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Pryor? Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Mr. King, aye. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Kirk? No. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss? No. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Heller? Mr. Heller? No.
that.
I just am worried.
We're not?
But you, I mean,
Yeah.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 64, the nays are 35. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion to waive is agreed to.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
we are going to have 3 more votes tonight, but I understand they're going to be voice votes. We've made significant progress with this important piece of legislation. The next vote will be at 11:15 tomorrow, and we expect to have the final vote on this bill tomorrow at 2 o'clock.
There are now 2 minutes equally divided.
Mr. President.
The Senator Reid of Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I understand the pending amendment is a Reid amendment. I also understand it will be accepted by a voice vote, and I would yield back my time.
Is there further debate? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are now 2 minutes equally divided. The Senator from New Jersey.
To reconsider and lay on the table.
Without objection. There are now 2 minutes equally divided on the amendment from Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I hope my colleagues will vote enthusiastically for this amendment. Across the country, communities and local organizations are trying to revive rivers that have been dammed and blocked. And when they go forward to remove a dam, when they go forward to put in a fish ladder, when they redesign a culvert to allow for water passage, they have to file a flood plan. And FEMA requires them to pay a fee to have that flood plan assessed. The fee is almost always waived, but they still have to go through the waiver process, which costs money and, frankly, can be as burdensome as simply paying the fee. This eliminates the fee, it eliminates that part of the progress, and allows towns and small organizations more readily to come to the aid of our old, small rivers. So I think this is something we should be able to agree on with great strength as a Senate. I think it's non-controversial, and I urge my colleagues to vote aye.
Is there further debate? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President.
Without objection. The Senator from New York.
I call up my amendment.
The amendment is
Pending.
pending.
Mr. President, my amendment is very simple and common sense. Many homeowners that live across the United States live in homes that simply cannot be elevated in order to protect or reduce flood risk because of their inherent structure. This is a problem that is true for cities in New York, cities in New Jersey, and in reality, if you live in a brownstone or you live in an apartment building, you can't raise them up to protect against flood damage. So to fix this problem, all my amendment does is require FEMA to provide a uniform set of guidelines describing FEMA-approved methods of mitigation, like flood-proofing or using flood-proof building materials to help these homeowners reduce their risk of flood damage. For example, don't leave computers and electrical equipment in your basement. Bring them to the first or second floor. Those kind of simple flood mitigation changes can easily save enormous amounts of money and risk the flood damage from flooding. The amendment also requires FEMA to consider any actions taken by homeowners to implement the methods identified in those guidelines when calculating flood insurance premium risk rates. By providing a clear set of mitigating guidance for these homeowners, this amendment will help homeowners to provide them more options to reduce their flood risk. I urge my colleagues to support this, and I believe it is non-controversial. Is there further debate?
Is there further debate? If not, the question is on Amendment 2708. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Move to reconsider and lay on the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I know that we're scheduled to take the final votes on this bill tomorrow morning and final passage at 2, and I just want to thank all the colleagues that were so cooperative today discussing and moving through these amendments, and really appreciate the cooperation, bipartisan cooperation, open debate process. I think it's been very helpful, and I think we're building a better flood insurance program for the country, which is our aim. So I yield the floor. I want to thank Senator Menendez, and particularly both Senator Menendez and Senator Isaacson for their leadership today. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for probably 15 minutes, as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this is the 56th time, the 56th consecutive week that we have been in session in the Senate that I have come to the floor to sound an alarm about carbon pollution and the harm that it is causing to our oceans and to our coastal communities. The 56th time. And frankly, I'm getting a little sick of it. I'm getting sick of the Republican Party being completely the tool of the polluters. I'm sick of the phony denial and of not getting anything done. And I'm sick of what it's going to say about American democracy.
Senate will come to order.
And I'm sick about what it's going to say about American democracy if we keep failing at this. But I'm going to keep pounding away because it is so vital to my ocean state. We are a little state with a lot of coast, and our sea level is rising, driven by faraway melting glaciers and everywhere expanding seawater. As oceans warm, the water expands. That's what liquids do. Deniers, look up thermal expansion of liquids and deny that. The most
important. Could we have order in the chamber?
Senate will come to order.
There's staff in the back that I can hear, and it's really difficult to hear the senator.
Senator from Rhode Island.
I thank the senator from California. The most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report projects that sea level will likely rise 1.5 to 3 feet by 2100 if we do what the polluters prefer and ignore the clear scientific evidence. And by the way, that's a conservative number. These rising sea levels hit coasts hard, particularly when storms beat those seas against our shores. And it's not just me saying that. We're supposed to listen to the nonpartisan Government Accountability Office around here. Well, a 2013 GAO report on climate change effects said this: storm surge, combined with sea level rise, is projected to generate a wide range of negative impacts on roads and bridges. For example, the report continued, storm surges are projected to increasingly inundate coastal roads, cause more frequent or severe flooding of low-lying infrastructure, erode road bases, and scour bridges by eroding riverbeds and exposing bridge foundations. Now, people from polluting states may think that that's funny, may think that that doesn't matter. But to a coastal state like mine, this is a serious threat. This chart shows the worldwide measured change in sea level. This is not some theory. Measured change in sea level, as well as a number of different models projecting future sea levels. You can see that sea level has been steadily rising over the past 130 years, generally consistent with human fossil fuel use. Between 1901 and 2010, sea level rise was estimated at 1.7 millimeters per year. Recently updated satellite measurements from the University of Colorado Sea Level Research Group show a rise of 3.2 millimeters per year from 1993 to 2013. The rate of increase has already nearly doubled, and according to the IPCC, that rate is likely to accelerate. In Rhode Island, our tide gauge in Newport shows an increase in average sea level of nearly 10 inches since 1930. Consistent with the global trends, measurements at our Newport tide gauge show that the rate of sea level rise has also increased in the past 2 decades. Local coastal erosion rates have doubled from 1990 to 2006, and some freshwater coastal wetlands are already transitioning to salt marsh from fresh water as they're inundated by the sea. Our Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council has documented 160 feet of shoreline lost to erosion in the town of South Kingstown since 1951, a rate of 3 feet per year. A steady 3 feet per year is one thing. Add a storm, and surges can wipe out whole swaths of land at once, as we saw with Superstorm Sandy. You can see the erosion here. Back in 1994, this beach pavilion was set back a good way from the water. By 2012, here, the ocean was just a few feet from the structure. This is the roof that is here. This is the framing that is here. And this is the very beginning of this walkway back here, and there's the ocean. The ocean has moved from here, essentially, to there. Roads and other infrastructure that was once a safe distance from the shoreline were also battered by this terrible storm surge and wind. The small, vibrant coastal town of Matunic, Rhode Island, is under siege from the advancing ocean. This chart shows how far the shoreline has shifted since 1951. Here's the 1951 shoreline, and this is the 2012 photo showing how much the sea has risen and eaten against the shores. In the last dozen years, beaches have eroded 20 feet. The community now faces difficult decisions, as the only road connecting Matunic to neighboring towns is protected by only about 10 feet of sand now. The road provides access for emergency vehicles residents may need, and underneath it lies their water main. If carbon dioxide emissions continue unchecked, another 5 feet of projected sea level rise is a real possibility after the year 2100. Matunic's projected coastline with 5 feet of sea level rise can be seen here in red. These are all houses. This is Roy Carpenter's beach. These houses have been here, in some cases, for generations, and they are tumbling into the sea as the ocean encroaches on them. This is famous Newport Harbor. In Newport, 5 feet of sea level rise would inundate large portions of our vibrant downtown area, including America's Cup Avenue, right here, including the Long Wharf Shopping Center, which would be about here, and including the famous and historic Cardines Field, a great old baseball field. Goat Island would just be a few specks of land. Here's what 3 feet of sea level rise would look like in Newport. Parati Park is gone. The Ann Street Pier is underwater. Not to mention the Newport Harbor Master's office. He'll be a lot closer to the harbor when it's pouring through his windows than he is right now. Wherever Rhode Island meets the sea, our homes and communities and our very economy are at stake. Yet, in Congress, we sleepwalk, lulled by the narcotic influence of the polluting special interests. No wonder I'm frustrated. When my colleagues say they're worried about job loss in the polluting coal and oil industries, I'm willing to listen. I'm even willing to help. But I'm not willing to stand by while this is happening in my home state and have you pretend that it's not even real. Rhode Island, of course, is not the only region experiencing sea level rise, coastal erosion, and economic disruption. Rising seas concern coastal regions across the country. With over 1,000 miles of coastline, Florida is at grave risk from sea level rise. According to the World Resources Institute and an article published in Environmental Research Letters, of all the people and housing in America threatened by sea level rise, 40% is in Florida. That's because in Florida, the flooding won't be just along the coast. Low-lying inland areas are also at risk. That's because Florida is built on porous limestone. In New England, on our rocky shores, you could perhaps build levees and dams in some places to hold the oceans back. In Miami, you'd be building those structures on geological sponge. The water will just seep right under. Using the best available science, the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact assessed the risk to 4 South Florida counties of sea level rise. In those counties, 1 foot of sea level rise would endanger approximately $4 billion in property. In Monroe County, 3 of the 4 hospitals, 2/3 of the schools, and 71% of emergency shelters are endangered by a 1-foot sea level rise. Go to 3 feet of sea level rise in these counties. That would endanger approximately $31 billion worth of property. That's a lot of infrastructure at risk. This map shows 3 feet of sea level rise in Miami-Dade County. The map on the left shows current elevation in southern Miami-Dade compared to 3 feet of sea level rise here on the right. These blue regions go underwater. You have lost acres upon acres of that city. This nuclear power station right here, Turkey Point, and this sewage treatment plant are virtually cut off from dry land. And yet, what do we hear from our Republican colleague from Florida? Denial, right along the polluter party line. Louisiana is teed up for worse storm surge by the warming, rising waters of the Gulf of Mexico. According to a U.S. Geological Survey-led study, between 1985 and 2010, Louisiana lost a football field an hour of land and wetlands to coastal erosion. A recent poll shows that Louisiana voters understand and want action on climate change. 72% of Louisianans believe climate change is a serious problem that threatens everyone. It is hitting their lives. And yet our Republican colleague from Louisiana offers streams of denial. The state with the most coastline is Alaska. Another U.S. Geological Survey study shows that coastal erosion along a 40-mile stretch on the Beaufort Sea has climbed from 20 feet per year between the mid-50s and the late 70s to 28 feet per year between the late 70s and 2000s, and now has more than doubled to 45 feet per year between 2002 and 2007. Climate change is one of several factors at play and is contributing to this accelerating loss. Earlier this month, our bicameral task force on climate change, which I lead with Congressman Waxman, welcomed Alaskans from the town of Shishmaref, an Inupiat Eskimo village located on a small barrier island 5 miles from mainland Alaska, to hear from them how climate change is affecting their home. Mr. President, their houses are literally falling into the sea, thanks to sea level rise and coastal erosion. Their centuries-old culture is crumbling away with each wave. This is a house in Shishmaref. This is a house at Roy Carpenter's Beach in Rhode Island. You can see how we can sympathize with the town of Shishmaref. In Alaska, Shishmaref is not alone. A recent GAO report shows that 31 Alaskan villages are at risk. The 12 red dots shown here are villages that are now considering relocating completely. According to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, relocation costs are estimated at $100 to $200 million for Shishmaref, and other villages could face similar costs. Stanley Taktu is the former mayor of Shishmaref. He came to our hearing and he said, "No matter your politics, you can't ignore the facts. The facts are that our village is being impacted by climate change on a daily basis, and we need you to do something about it." No matter your politics, he said, you can't ignore the facts. Well, the painful truth, Mayor Taktu, is that around here in Congress, if you have certain politics, you're actually obliged to ignore the facts. You are required to ignore the facts. Your big money people, the big polluters, the Koch brothers, insist on it. They demand that you ignore the facts. And Citizens United, that god-awful Supreme Court decision, means that the big polluters' big money can drown out in elections, particularly in Republican primary elections, every reasonable person, Republican, Independent, or Democrat, who gets that we need to act. So the party on the other side is stuck, trapped by the campaign finance rules and the big money of the big polluters. We could, in Congress, be awake and helping and meeting the call of duty. We could be working with the President to implement his climate action plan. The Environment and Public Works Committee, under the strong leadership of Chairman Barbara Boxer, recently held an oversight hearing on the President's climate action plan. What did we get in that hearing from our Republican colleagues? Denial, quarreling, and obfuscation. The polluter party line. They actually brought in, as a Republican witness, a witness whose organization took money from the Koch brothers and Exxon, and from other far-right and denier foundations, including the notorious Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund, which launders money from big donors who want to remain anonymous. If you have not heard of this Donors Trust and Donors Capital Group, a recent report out of Drexel University described this group as the, quote, black box that conceals the identity of contributors and the, quote, central component and, quote, dominant funder of the denier apparatus. That was who they chose as their witness. We could, in Congress, be figuring out how a carbon pollution fee, one that returns all its proceeds right back to the American people, could best boost our economy, as some prominent Republicans have suggested. But I sent a letter to my Republican colleagues summarizing the Republican case for a carbon fee, and not one responded. The polluters have the Republican Party at their heels. It's a tragic state of affairs for a great political party. Mr. President, carbon pollution from the burning of fossil fuels is altering the atmosphere and oceans. It is changing our climate. The scientific consensus around this fact is overwhelming. Denial at this point is propped up, polluter-paid nonsense. Where carbon pollution hits the oceans, denial requires you not just to reject science, but to reject measurement. You measure sea level rise. You measure ocean warming. You measure ocean acidification. It's not complicated. You measure sea level rise more or less with a yardstick. You measure ocean warming with a thermometer. You measure ocean acidification with simple litmus tests that everyone with an aquarium is familiar with. And yet, despite that incontrovertible evidence from our oceans, we sleepwalk on in Congress, thanks to a great political party's captivity by polluters. It's a disgrace. It will go down in history as a disgrace. We could strengthen our economy. We could save our great coastal cities and our age-old island villages. And we can leave things better, not worse, for the generations that will follow us. But we have to pay attention to reality. We have to pay attention to the real evidence. We can't be swept up in the toxic, polluter-paid politics that infect Washington. Mr. President, this matters immensely to Alaska. It matters immensely to the citizens of Shishmaref. It matters immensely to the residents of Florida who are looking at their cities sinking, and it matters immensely to Rhode Island, the ocean state, because the undeniable changes from sea level rise and warming are upon us already and will only worsen. For once and for all, Mr. President, it is time for us to wake up.
Would the senator yield for colloquy?
Please.
Through the chair.
The senator from California.
First, I just want to say how proud I am to